I'm Sumi Somaskanda, a U.S. correspondent for DW News. With defense ministers from around the world meeting to discuss how best to support Ukraine, we wanted to get the U.S. position on everything from sending battle tanks to how to continue support for the country. We're happy to have with us Congressman Adam Smith. He's a Democrat from the state of Washington, and he is the top Democrat in the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives. Congressman Smith, thank you very much for joining us. Good to have you with us on DW. I'm going to start with the question of tanks because this is the big topic of discussion at the moment. Should Germany be sending its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine?
Yes, I think clearly they should. Now, in all of these questions on a lot of different weapon systems, I mean, you got to get into some details here about what's available, how it impacts the national security of the country in question. But in this case, many of the tanks Germany doesn't even have. It's a matter of them giving permission to other countries that they've sold the tanks to transfer them. So I think clearly in this case that should be done. So yes, I'm a strong supporter of sending those tanks. I'm, in general, a supporter of the U.S. sending the Abrams tanks as well. That's a bit more complicated. They're further away, and we have to do the same calculation about what's in our stockpile. How do we make sure we're still meeting our national security needs as we decide whether or not to make those transfers? But yes, I think we should transfer tanks to Ukraine.
I do want to ask you, there has been criticism, particularly in Germany, that the country continues to lead from behind and wait for the U.S. to lead the way when it comes to sending different types of weapon systems to Ukraine. Do you agree with that criticism?
I think that there's sort of one way of looking at this, which is whatever Ukraine wants, you send them, and there's no point in even you send it, and there's no point in even thinking about it. And I don't really agree with that. I think we need to sort of look at what has happened, since this war began, and even in the lead up to it. The 50 nations, or I think it's slightly more than that now, have really come together and presented a united front and provided Ukraine with a ton of assistance, both military and others. And Germany has been part of that, a key leader. Now, I personally have disagreed with some decisions that our country has made, as well as Germany and others, about what we should or should not send. But no one should mistake the fact that this is an incredible effort to support the Ukrainian people on the behalf of all those countries, even if you can look at one or two decisions. So I don't think actually it's a fair criticism to say that Germany has dragged its feet just because, somebody in the process has said, well, you ought to send them that, you ought to send it now.
I want to ask you about that process of weighing up what should be sent to Ukraine and when, weighing up the number of factors that go into that decision. As you said, originally the U.S. and its allies were more cautious about what types of weapons could be sent to support Ukraine. But now we are talking about battle tanks. We know that the Patriot missile systems were also approved. Is there a sort of red line? Are there weapons that you think, you're on the Armed Services Committee, the top Democrat in that committee, are there weapons the U.S. should not send?
You'd have to get into a deep calculation on that. I mean, obviously, you can envision some weapons they shouldn't send. Let's just go out and state clearly, shouldn't be sending nuclear weapons. How's that? As far as the rest of it, the calculation that I'm primarily focused on, that a lot of people don't think about, is what are our national security needs? We cannot put ourselves in the position where we're not able to meet those needs. For instance, there's been talk about longer range weapons, and I think we should send Ukraine longer range weapons, but we don't have as many of those weapons as some people may think, and we do have our own needs. When you're talking about the ATACMS, the longer range weapon that can go on a HIMARS system, how many do we have? How many can we produce? That calculation needs to be made. So, I think that it's a difficult balance. And the second piece of this is, Putin has been threatening massive escalation all along the way. He's drawn more red lines than any of us can remember. And early on, you may think, he's bluffing, but you don't know for sure. And it's a pretty important bluff. So you might want to be a little bit cautious about challenging that. As the conflict has progressed, I think we've seen that Russia doesn't want a direct conflict with the U.S. and NATO any more than we do. So therefore, that calculation has changed the risk.
Do I understand you correctly that you're less worried, or the U.S. is less worried about Russia's response now than it might have been, let's say, when the war began?
Yeah, I think that's the wrong way to put it. We are worried about it. We are less of the opinion that they will respond in a highly escalatory manner than we used to be. I wouldn't say we're less worried about it because we're talking about, we're talking about World War III if we're wrong. So we're going to be worried about it and focused on it. But the calculation has definitely become clear in the last, few months in particular, that Russia is worried about that broader escalation as well.
The Biden administration has said all along it will do whatever it takes to support Ukraine. What will it take for Ukraine to actually win this conflict, and can Ukraine do so?
I think what we've seen on the plus side is the Ukrainian military is vastly more capable than anybody calculated or anybody thought. And they are using the weapons we send them and the resources we send them in a very smart, strategic, tactical, intelligent way. They're good fighters and they're making progress. Second, we've seen that the Russian military is vastly less capable than some had assumed. So the Ukrainians, bottom line, are doing better in the conflict than we thought. The second thing we've seen, which is not terribly surprising, however, is that Russia, is willing to sacrifice at a very high level to keep this fight going. Putin is very reluctant to give up on the dream of completely dominating Ukraine. And he's keeping the fight going past the point, frankly, that it's in Russia's best interest to do so. And what does that mean? I mean, if he, starts bringing in, thousands of prisoners and thousands of untrained troops and throwing them at the front line, how does that change the fight? We're learning that as we go.
I do want to ask you about the political landscape here in the U.S., because some European allies have looked with some apprehension at the fact that Republicans now are in control of the House of Representatives. And we know there are some Republicans who have said they cannot continue to support, to send weapons and aid to Ukraine, certainly not in the scale that has been done until now. Are you worried about the ability of the U.S. to continue to support Ukraine in the way that it has?
First, with the good news, we passed a lot of aid for Ukraine before the end of last Congress, and that aid's going to last quite a while. How long? I don't know. I've heard calculations that it can last out the year. We'll see. It depends on the fight, depends on where it goes. But we've got a long lag time here of having already provided resources. So whatever the House Republicans want to do isn't going to get in the way of that. But once we start to need more support, yes, I think it's going to be a significant challenge. Now, it's worth pointing out here, the overwhelming majority of House Republicans are frankly more hawkish on supporting Ukraine than just about anybody. Certainly, Mike Rogers, who's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee now, took over for me. Mike Turner's chair of the Intel Committee, McCall, who is the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. They are all in, as are many other senior Republicans. So the majority of the House and the majority of the Republican caucus, by a long margin, is supportive of this. Now, that small, dedicated group who are willing to tear down just about anything to get what they want are a problem. And they may well get in the way of that. The one big point they like to point to, well, we need oversight of the aid. We have oversight of the aid. It's very clear that Ukrainians are making excellent use of the equipment that we are sending them. They aren't stealing it. They aren't, falling into corruption. They're using it to defend their country. So we have oversight. That's a bit of a red herring to argue about, well, we just need more oversight. There are just some Republicans who don't want to support this for a variety of different reasons. But again, small minority. So I believe we can work around that, but it's a challenge without question.
And Congressman, my last question, what is the message that you like to continue to give to Americans of why it is important for the U.S. to continue to support Ukraine, even if this conflict does drag on for longer than we perhaps anticipated?
Yeah, and I think that's really the central question. And we have to give the broader narrative. Certainly, you look at what's going on in Ukraine, and there is no doubt that what's happening to the Ukrainian people is brutal and unfair, and they deserve to be helped if possible to defend themselves against a violent, homicidal aggressor, which is Putin and Russia. I mean, there is no doubt about it that Ukraine is the country that deserves our support in this conflict. But then step back in terms of the broader world. We in the United States benefit from a peaceful, stable, rules-based international order as much as anybody in the world. And if Russia can do this, that order is deeply threatened. And it won't just be in Ukraine. Where does Russia go next? How does President Xi in China interpret this, in Taiwan and in other places? If Russia is able to succeed, we have an unstable world that could drift into more and more conflicts that will be more and more deadly and costly for everybody in the world, including the US. This is a core principle that is going to have a lot to say about what the world looks like for decades to come after this conflict. And that directly affects the core interests of every single person in the United States. I would submit most people throughout the world. That's why this is important.
Congressman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate the chance.